Okay. So I guess we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the WEKH SheEO Data Learning Lab. My name is Megan. I'm the Associate Director of Partnership Development and Stewardship at the Diversity Institute, which leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. Thank you so much for being here. And I would first and foremost like to acknowledge that the work we do takes place on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our partners across Canada similarly gather on the traditional territory of Canada's Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. And now I'm going to hand it over to our Executive Director, Erin Roach, for the opening presentation.
Hello, everyone. This is my first Zoom presentation since I've been back from maternity leave. So if things go horribly awry, I believe I have backups on hand. But as Megan said, I'm Erin Roach. I'm the Executive Director at the Diversity Institute. And we are at the Ted Rogers School of Management's Diversity Institute. We are the lead of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which is a national network funded through Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, which provides a platform for sharing research, resources, leading practices, and strategies across the ecosystem of organizations that are currently serving or who should be serving women entrepreneurs in Canada. We have 10 regional hubs and a network of more than 250 organizations, and we're designed to address the needs of diverse women entrepreneurs across Canada, across regions, across sectors, working with service providers, academics, government, and industry to enhance their support for women entrepreneurs. So today I'll be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, program evaluation, which I don't get to talk about enough. And we specifically at the Diversity Institute take an ecosystem approach to program evaluation. So I'll walk you through some of the lens and the challenges that you face in taking an ecosystem approach. And then we're going to toss the mic over to SheEO, who is doing a fabulous job in this and really has established its leadership in terms of building excellent data collection, feedback loops, dashboards, etc. So really excited to see what they have to show as well. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to talk just quickly about who the Diversity Institute is, what program evaluation is, and why we do it. Define some of the context, goals, and objectives, how to develop a logic model. I'm going to stop a little short of the nitty-gritty of actually doing evaluations. That's something I think perhaps we'll explore in a further session, and also talk about challenges. So for 20 years, the Diversity Institute has been undertaking research that's aimed at advancing diversity and inclusion in organizations in order to build workforce and skills development and innovation ecosystems that are both diverse and inclusive. We now have 100 staff, and we oversee some really large projects like the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, the Future Skills Centers Research Branch, Diversity Leads, which is benchmarked diversity across 6 sectors in Canada, and the Advanced Digital and Professional Training Program, which is a work integrated learning program that helps explore alternative pathways for graduates to careers in digital careers. We have a diversity assessment tool that has been used across sectors to encourage organizations to apply a diversity and inclusion lens across their value chains, including procurement, including human resources, how they measure their performance, and how they conduct outreach and build the pipeline. And we have done that across some of the innovation ecosystem in Canada, including with FedDev Ontario, with incubators across Ontario, and a variety of other organizations. And we have also done some program evaluations. These are large projects ranging from working with Ontario Human Rights Commission and Toronto Police Services to working with Canada Learning Code to evaluate their $50 million initiative, and some smaller evaluations with the Business Out of a Box model with Scadencourt Community Center, as well as ensuring that the Future Skills Center has some robust theories of change and strong logic models that go along with the work they're doing. So that's just to give you an idea of what our interest is and our experience in this space. So next, I guess the questions to explore are what is program evaluation and why do we do it? So at WEKH, we're interested, and WEKH is the unfortunate acronym for the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which I know is confusing with the folks in British Columbia, but I'll use it because it's easy to say. We're interested in what works. So we're working with organizations like SheEO, Femizor, the Evidence Network, and other groups on strengthening our evaluation frameworks. And I know many people do evaluation because they have to. We really see it as critical to changing systems and to understand if programs are effective. So are they working well? What improvements are needed? And identifying and sharing what works and what new knowledge and best practices can we transfer across the ecosystem. It also helps facilitate decision-making. And this is important, of course, for determining what to invest your money in, and for governments to as well decide what to invest their money in and what to support. But I think most importantly, it helps you track your outcomes to see if your programs are indeed having the impact that you expected that they would have, and to create some rigor into the process. So if they're not, you can review your underlying assumptions and see where perhaps your theory of change might have been misplaced, and you can test and iterate and really try to learn from things that might have been considered failures. And when we're looking at evaluation, there's different levels at which we consider it. So one is context and strategy. And this is important because sometimes the framing of programs and projects can be problematic. And we've talked a lot about this through our research with WEKH, where we've talked about, for example, if you define a woman entrepreneur as someone who is a majority owner of a SME with employees, there's 114,000 in Canada. On the other hand, if you define it as someone who's self-employed, it's 1 million. So ways in which we actually define what we're trying to do will have a profound impact on how we set our goals and how we set up the process. So it's important to start with a critical eye to your strategy for your evaluation. Then we turn to the inputs and what those inputs are to the process that we're undertaking. These could be your connection to your stakeholders, your ideas, your resources, data you're going to use, information, whatever. Then we consider the process that you're applying to translate those inputs to outputs. So in the case of many women enterprise organizations of Canada, for instance, the processes would include training programs, advisory services, access to funding, mentoring, and so on. All the great work that you're doing across the ecosystem would go there. And then there's the outcomes. And these are the ways that you think about what you're trying to accomplish in the short, medium, and long term. And this is done through impact evaluation. And outcomes would have to do, for example, with the number of companies that are created, that are grown, number of employees, progress on the sustainable development goals, and so on. And ultimately, when we talk about the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, we're also talking about driving systems change. And then if we look at the how we evaluate programs, it follows a similar process. So we start with defining the context, the goals, the objectives, and constraints. And we develop, and based on that, we develop what we call a logic model. And a logic model or theory of change simply clarifies those assumptions about what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and what the processes are that convert those inputs to outcomes. So it's really just a way of making sure that we're really clear about our assumptions of what leads to what. And this is important because sometimes those assumptions are wrong, and sometimes there's not a connection between the inputs that we put into a program and the outcomes. And evaluation will show you that, and there's many intervening factors that could influence your success, or our success, I guess, if we look at us like an ecosystem. So by being systematic in how we think about what it is we're doing, what it is we're trying to accomplish, and what's the logical connection between the activities we're undertaking and the results, we introduce a kind of rigor and discipline to the process. Okay, so what are the challenges? We already know that there's challenges, as I said at the outset, around definitions of entrepreneurship. We have challenges around the definitions of women entrepreneurs. So for example, some organizations are defining women entrepreneurs as 50+1% ownership. Others are defining women entrepreneurs as anyone who owns more than 25% of a company. And some are arguing that we need to think about these thresholds because, for example, if a company attracts investors, the women-owned share is diluted. So one of the things we've seen when we compare programs across Canada is that the very definition of woman entrepreneur is different. And one of the things we're arguing is you have to be precise. So when you're collecting data, you collect data on the organizations you're serving that are 50+1% owned by women, but you're also collecting data on organizations that are equally owned between men and women. You're collecting data on organizations that are between 25 and 49% owned by women. And the reason we want to be that specific is that way we can compare apples to apples across the ecosystem. And we also know that one of our big challenges is the equation of entrepreneurs with men and with STEM. And that shapes what some of the funders are looking for. So many may measure innovation based on patents or IP rather than, for example, new products or services. But we have to be really careful about the assumptions that are underpinning these things that we're evaluating. And we also know from the research that a lot of programs that are in place focus on high growth businesses or businesses that are focused on innovation. Yet we know from the research that has been done that many women may not have growth as one of their principal goals. So we have to consider that in where we're focusing. We also know that entrepreneurship is often seen primarily as an economic activity, even though there's nothing in the definition that makes that assumption. And in fact, many would argue that social entrepreneurship is even more important in terms of the future of the planet. Vicky and SheEO, of course, have the to-do list of things to undertake. And I think that's a really important angle to take. Often evaluation frameworks also don't allow for things like personal goals and satisfaction to be considered, or things like systems perspectives or intersectional perspectives, and really understanding what some of the conditions are that either enable or constrain entrepreneurship, and so on. So we want to make sure that whatever framework is used for evaluating our individual programs and for the women entrepreneurship strategy overall takes into account these multiple layers of impact. And in fact, many of you know that we're trying to understand the ecosystem as a whole through WEKH and how the pieces intersect. So rather than focusing on organizations that are specifically defined as supporting women entrepreneurs, like the Women Enterprise Organizations of Canada, SheEO, and so on, we are also trying to dig in and look at groups like the regional development agencies and what they're doing and how they're serving women or not, and how they're serving diverse women or not, and the impact of their programs on diverse women entrepreneurs. We're also looking at processes in banks and who's included and who's excluded from those processes. So some of the recent research suggests that if you have a man and a woman that have similar assets and experiences and they go into a bank, they're actually likely to be equally treated. But what that doesn't take into account is that very often the systems used to evaluate things like risk have biases built into them. So maybe they're being treated when they're there, but actually the systems have been developed based on businesses that men are more likely to own. So things with physical assets, IP, for example. So we think it's really important as a starting point in understanding the impact of the women entrepreneurship strategy and what the impact of all of our different programs and initiatives are, is to understand how the system works and how the measures work at the systems level. If we're trying to double the number of women entrepreneurs by 2025, are we talking about SMEs owned by women, or are we talking about self-employed women? If we're talking about SMEs owned by women, then we should be focusing more on trying to convert women who are self-employed to women who own SMEs. Are we focused on growth? Are we focusing on sustainability? There's a big emphasis, of course, on growth, but with growth comes risk. So a lot of incubators do indeed produce unicorns and highly successful startups, but at the same time, the odds are maybe 1 in 10. Whereas on the other hand, there's many community-based entrepreneurship support programs that are supporting mainstream businesses that are never going to be billion-dollar companies, but that are going to be sustainable over the long term. So it's a trade-off in our view between putting all your eggs in the basket of high growth and high risk, as opposed to turning your eye to stability and businesses that support people's livelihoods. And we're working with a number of organizations through WEKH and the Diversity Institute, including the OECD, and that's to make sure that the macro assessments of what innovation is and what entrepreneurship is and what the contributions are to GDP are inclusive and holistic. Because many of those definitions and those understandings drive so many other things. And we've been on calls, for example, where people will argue that the way to measure innovation is by looking at patents that are filed or IP. But as soon as you do that, you exclude potentially some of the rural innovations. You may exclude retail and services. You may exclude Indigenous people who use Indigenous knowledge and culture, but perhaps are less likely to register patents or trademarks around it. So the way in which we define things at a macro level has a profound impact that cascades all the way through the system. And what's really interesting is that increasingly progressive organizations are starting to think about inclusive development as key, as you can see in this slide. So we're not just talking about growth, we're also talking about inclusion. We're also talking about intergenerational equity and sustainability and the longer term impacts of what we're doing. The other thing that's important is ensuring that we have measures that are appropriate for the stage of development. So if you have programs that are primarily focused on people who are at an early stage starting up, that maybe a lot of your measures might have to do with learning or capacity, because we know at the early stage, many startups may not progress. They could reconfigure, they could join each other, become a lot different than they originally anticipated. We also know that many people go into an incubator and actually gain skills that are transferable into mainstream employment. And we're finding that in work we're doing with immigrant populations and Black and marginalized populations, where they've come into programs and it gets them engaged with entrepreneurship. And it's really not necessarily focused on creating the business, though that might be an outcome. It's also focused on experiential learning opportunities. People could learn English, develop financial literacy, and other benefits. So we have to make sure the measures are appropriate to the stage of development. And that's why it's really important to start with what your assumptions are, what the issues are, and how you're going to measure success. So some of the approaches, you can use literature review, analyze data sets, netnography, this image is some netnography that was done, key informant interviews, focus groups, etc., in order to define what are the critical issues, key thematic areas, and priorities that are going to underpin your evaluation. And then the logic model is the next step. So developing a logic model is actually a really fun process, and it's a simple concept that portrays graphically, I say simple, but it's kind of like the tip of a giant iceberg, that portrays graphically what you have in your head about the steps in your process, what the inputs are, what your activities are, and what you're trying to develop in terms of specific outputs, and how these translate into short, medium, and long-term outcomes. As this figure depicts, the purposes of entrepreneurship training programs or entrepreneur support programs can be expressed in terms such as, and just so you know, this is from a report that the Evidence Network did with us, who I believe might be on the call, and this is on our WEKH website. And so they can be expressed in terms such as inclusive entrepreneurship, community improvements, and economic development. And to achieve these purposes, programs contribute inputs, again, funding, staff, facilities, etc., to conduct activities, which could be providing services or financial support. Not in this diagram, though important, are outputs, which would be the volume, quantity, or amount of direct products stemming from the activities. So they're the evidence that the activity took place. And as a result of these activities and outputs, the programs achieve direct impacts on the capabilities of clients, and this leads to indirect impact on client performance and business performance, which ultimately leads to long-term impacts in the form of socioeconomic benefits, which are what we're really looking for in the broader community. And I guess really this impact on clients is really a critical part of program evaluation. Because, while governments may be, really interested in business performance, there's actually, a lot of transferable skill sets and knowledge and skills that come out of entrepreneur support programs for clients who may not actually end up launching a company. And if you're not looking at that level, you're missing and underreporting on your program's impact. Then, of course, the broader societal impacts on the economy and society are the ultimate goals. These are, of course, very difficult to measure, and due to diffused effects and time lags of, being able to attribute program impact. So impact measures can be defined at individual, organizational, and societal levels. And this table summarizes some of the metrics at a high level, not the indicators, but more the high-level metrics that were identified by the Evidence Network when they reviewed more than 100 journal articles and documents from academic and grey literature. Of course, actual indicators should be much more specific, observable, and measurable characteristics, very precise, using, the number or percent of concrete measures. We're not going to go into all the nitty-gritty details, even though that would be fun. We can leave that for another time. So to wrap up, I'll just review again some of the challenges that we've defined, and that's defining woman entrepreneur. So how we define and measure will be critically important as an ecosystem to ensure that we have comparable data across the ecosystem. Understanding where people were at the beginning of their programs, where they're starting from on their entrepreneurship journey, is important to understand what impact we should expect. Also, what sectors they are playing in will have an impact on what to expect as well. Then there's questions around capacity for good program report writing, and some organizations will, of course, be really good at writing up their evaluation reports, while others, but that doesn't necessarily reflect a good program. So we have to acknowledge that some organizations will have more capacity than others, and supporting those who do need some capacity in that area. And time and resources do need to be invested in evaluation because of the many reasons we've pointed out for why they're important. And ensuring feedback loops and actions, also critically important. And that's why we're going to kick this conversation over to SheEO, who actually has some really exciting ways of building in those feedback loops and taking actionable insights to develop programs and share the information coming out of them. And that's all for me. So I will pass it over to SheEO, and thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Erin, for that wonderful overview on program evaluation. It's definitely something that we're thinking a lot about at SheEO and links directly to what we're going to talk about in terms of our data strategy. So I'll share my screen here. And I'll introduce myself. So hi, everybody. My name is Tanya Chang. I'm really excited to be joining this call from the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and the Wabanaki Confederacy, which is just outside of Halifax, Nova Scotia. I lead process innovation here at SheEO, and I also work alongside Anna and others on our team to take care of and make use of the data that come our way. And so I'll pass it over to Anna to quickly introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Matthew. I'm the Impact Reporting and Knowledge Manager at SheEO, and I come from a background of nonprofit management and also information management. I have my Master of Information from the U of T's iSchool, which is basically like a librarianship program. So I come at things from a librarian point of view. And I'll pass back to Tanya to talk a little bit more about SheEO. Thanks,
Anna. We're very excited to share a little bit about our data strategy. But first, just a little bit of an overview of SheEO. I think many of you are aware of SheEO already. I think some of you are on the call are activators yourself. So just in case there are folks who are new to SheEO, I'll give a super quick overview. So SheEO is a global community of women that supports women entrepreneurs who are working on the world's to-do list. So that's our name for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We're building a $1 billion perpetual fund through the radical generosity of our community of activators. So activators are women who make a radically generous contribution of $1,100 or $92 a month. And these contributions are pooled together into a fund that is then distributed via 0% interest loans to women entrepreneurs who are addressing some of the world's biggest challenges through their ventures. These are just some of the highlights of our impact so far, just to give you a sense of the volume of data that we're working with. So as of today, our community has expanded to over 5,000 activators. We funded 73 ventures with a lot more coming soon. We're just in the middle of voting in 3 regions. The model is now in 5 countries, and we've distributed over $5 million in venture loans. So that's a quick overview of what we're up to at SheEO and the types of data and the size of community that we're working with. And I'll pass it back to Anna, who's going to speak a bit about how we approach our data strategy.
Sure, thanks, Tanya. So actually the first slide I have to show you is just a little visualization that is something I always come back to, especially when I'm trying to advocate for good data management. And it's basically like knowledge management 101, this pyramid that takes you from data at the bottom to wisdom at the top. And really it's just to help you understand, how do you turn data into something that can help you make choices. So data itself is just raw values. They're just symbols, right? They're just little things. They don't actually have any meaning. When you put the data into something relational, like a database system, it turns it into information. It gets meaning from that relationship. So an example would be a telephone number is just 10 digits until you put it in a field called phone number. Then suddenly it answers the what of what that is. And then knowledge, it's really us either through memorization or through understanding, taking that information and amassing learning. So it might be, one set of information, or it might be several sets of information, but you're turning it into knowledge. I know something about how we run events based on, every year's registration data and the meaning I've gotten out of that through the database system. And then wisdom at the top, that is us taking those knowledge sets and making choices, making judgments, making discernments, you know, based on our human intellect, our morality, our ethics, whatever it is, mixed with the knowledge that we have. So arguably the middle parts of the pyramid could be done by AI. It doesn't necessarily need to be done by a human. In my opinion, the top is where, you know, a human being is really, really required. But that is the goal. And when I'm trying to advocate with, you know, members on the team or members in the community for making really strong planning and technical decisions about data, it's about how do we take data up the pyramid and turn it into wisdom so that we can make good choices. Tanya, if you don't mind switching slides. So what I'm showing you right now are 3 examples of dashboards that we've built at SheEO, which are taking data that we have coming through various engagement points and turning them into a tool that we can use to make wise organizational decisions. So technically speaking, I'm taking data that's coming through a piece of software. Maybe it's an event registration tool, maybe it's our activation portal or a venture application portal. I'm taking that raw data, passing it through to a relational database. Maybe it's Google Sheets, maybe it's Salesforce. And I connected it with a reporting tool called Google Data Studio. And what that allows me to do is, you know, turn those pieces of information into charts, metrics that are meaningful to people, that can have filters applied to them so that the person viewing them can select which information they want to see. And the information is coming in live. So it's you know, someone registers for the event, it's immediately passing through to this dashboard and updating the event dashboard, for instance. Some considerations when I am setting up something like this is, you know, first think of any technical parameters you have with the data collection tool, what the form software is, the event tool, the portal, whatever platform you're using, what pieces of data you want to collect and what you want to show in the dashboard. It's really important at the setup point to talk to the people who are actually going to be using this. So in SheEO's case, it's probably the program pod, it's, you know, the activator team, it's the venture team, potentially people more broadly in our community who need to interact with the information. And don't get distracted by everything you can do. Really important to distill it down to what is actually going to be useful information to make a decision. It's easy to get distracted by shiny objects because, you know, the possibilities are endless when it comes to tools like this, but try and keep it to pieces of information that are actually going to be useful to people. Tanya, maybe if you want to open one of them up, I can just do a closer look at, you know, the kinds of things you can actually do with a tool like this. So this is a dashboard that is showing activations in Canada as we, you know, really important as we go through campaigns. So we just finished a campaign season earlier this fall. So it's really showing live, like what activations are coming in, how did they hear? Are these new versus returning? Are they single year or are they recurring activations? Where are these people coming from? The reactivation bar showing us who did we have last year that still hasn't reactivated? Who do we have to go back to and re-engage with? Demographics at the bottom showing us more about the diversity of our community, how we're growing, etc. So all of this happens live and allows our activator pod to make choices about how they nurture the campaign. And we share it more broadly with the community so that activators can see who they're in relationship with. The venture application one is a good example of how, again, we're doing similar things like we did, like I mentioned with the activator dashboard, but we're also reminding ourselves of timelines here. So, you know, it's always nerve-wracking to see, okay, we're trying to get this many applications in. We don't have that many yet. Oh yeah, last year and the year before. most of them come in and, during the last week, maybe even the last 2 days. So you can start to see, the knowledge doesn't have to be just about what's happening right now. It can be like, how do I compare this knowledge set to the knowledge set I have last year?
I'm just going to show this cool SDG part.
Yeah. So this is showing of all the applications we've received this year, who's working on which part of the world's to-do list. And actually, Tanya, if you can scroll to the very top, one thing we did with this dashboard this year was, instead of having to build 5 different dashboards, we're just using a filter at the top. So it's the same dashboard, it's the same data set coming in, and we're just choosing which regions we want to display at what time. And you can see it was just defaulted to UK, Canada, and USA. That's because those are the regions we're actively taking applications in right now. Okay, I think we could probably move on to the next slide.
Awesome.
Oh, yeah. Good. Sorry, just passing to Tanya.
All right, so I'll speak a little bit about our feedback process and how we collect feedback from our community. Feedback and iteration are super, super important to us at SheEO. It's, the way that we've been able to scale so quickly and efficiently is really through our ability to pay attention and notice what's happening around us and then get to action when things need to shift. So this slide shares some of the processes and structures that help us to collect, to listen, to make sense of, and then to make use of the feedback from our community. So first, we collect feedback at every touch point, whether it's an activator call, a public event, a learning lab, venture voting, you name it. And all of the feedback is collected on Airtable, which is where we've developed an architecture or framework for the types of feedback data that we want to collect. So for every single experience, the feedback form that we share out could include ratings on 4 key metrics. So the first is experience. Was that positive and was that experience a positive one for you, for example? 2, connections. Did you make a new connection, meet someone new? 3, recommendations. So would you recommend this event to someone else or to a friend? And goals, did this event help you to achieve your goals? So the specific wording of the question might slightly differ from event to event, depending on what it is that we're evaluating. But the metric that it's measuring, like the bucket, it remains the same. And so all of the ratings on these metrics across all these different events can be collected and captured in the same database and then analyzed in aggregate. Likewise, we also collect 2 pieces of qualitative feedback for every experience. So the first one is looking back and sharing just a bit more about how that experience was for that person, and then looking forward, any ideas or suggestions for the future. So again, we've built all of this out on Airtable. So all of our forms are generated on Airtable. All the data is fed into the same place. And that makes it really easy for us to then view, sort, manipulate, and use the data as we need to. And to help us make use of this data, we've set up an automated Slack notification so that every time someone submits a feedback form, it automatically right away sends that submission into a Slack channel that's called feedback. So this allows our team to see feedback literally right away and then also respond to it in real time if needed. So on Slack, if you use Slack, it's easy to tag someone in a thread and say, hey, have you seen this? And then have a whole conversation about how to address or make use of that piece of feedback. In addition to the Slack messages, we've set up a weekly feedback meeting that especially anybody who's involved in community-facing programming will attend. And these meetings are an opportunity for us to discuss the feedback that we've been getting, to ask bigger questions about what we're noticing, and to brainstorm together ways that we can iterate based on what we're hearing. A good example of how we've been using this feedback is with our weekly activator calls. So this was something that we started since just after COVID. So just a weekly call to bring our activator community together to connect and ask for what they need when the pandemic hit. But since March, it's, those calls have really evolved, and now they now include mini coaching sessions with our venture development guide, MJ Ryan. There's different breakout group discussions, one-on-one chats, etc. It's really become a staple in our activator programming, and a lot of these tweaks and iterations have come about from listening, from noticing what's working, what's not working based on our feedback, and then just following the energy and continuing to just iterate, tweak, and shift. And because we track everything, it makes it easier too to be transparent and share back with our community what it is that we're hearing, and then what we're doing in response. And then the last thing I want to share around our process is that we also have a dashboard that allows us to take a step back and see some of those bigger trends and look at those ratings in aggregate over time. This slide just shares a little bit more about what I just spoke about, but what happens in the back end when someone shares their feedback. So as I mentioned, we've automated and integrated all of these different tools together. We use Zapier, it's an automation tool. And so that's what allows the data to flow from Airtable to Sheets to Data Studio, and Airtable to Slack without really any manual intervention. So all of this just happens right away, which means less time spent tracking the data and more time synthesizing and turning it into knowledge and wisdom. So that's a little bit about our feedback process, and I'll pass it back to Anna to speak about different data needs.
Thanks, Tanya. So what we've got here is just a little grid of, the push and pull that we're always dealing with when we're collecting data and trying to make use of the data. So I'll just walk you through each of these. So the first thing is user experience versus reporting, right? So we're collecting data from people at various engagement points, maybe registering for an event, activating, applying to be a venture. And we have reporting requirements internally, what we've decided is important in order to operate, more broadly with our community, what stories do we want to share with them, and potentially, something that is external to us. Maybe we have a funding requirement that requires certain pieces of data. So always trying to balance, like, what is the collection engagement experience for the user versus what do we need to report on, and how do we make sure, we're meeting both of those needs appropriately and not skewing too much to one or the other. The next one is custom fields versus standard fields. So when should you customize and when should you standardize? And obviously different engagement points, different programs, and potentially different software platforms are going to require customization, and that is okay. But when you can standardize, when you can start asking for the same pieces of data in the same way, try and do that. So, we have a standard set of personal identity questions that we have agreed we have to ask across certain engagement points. So as much as possible within the technical possibilities that you have, try to ask those in the same way. And then even custom fields, if there's a way that you can try and develop some consistency there, that can really be beneficial to how much analysis you can do with the data. So the feedback architecture that Tanya referenced is a good example of this. It's agreed across the team that we need to be able to create feedback forms for an engagement point that makes sense to the context of that engagement. But for us to be able to aggregate feedback data and make real information and knowledge out of it, some standardization is required. So what we did is, we created those buckets, those feedback buckets, the 4 rating ones and the 2 qualitative ones, looking back, looking forward. And those are standard fields. Any piece of data that falls in that bucket is going to be collected and pushed into that bucket. But what Airtable allows us to do is to make, different form views of those buckets. So we can call the about the experience question whatever we want. The prompt text can be different depending on whether this was about, how was your voting experience versus how did you like our global summit. So data formats and platform functionality, just, something to think about. You need to be able to ask for certain pieces of data in certain ways. You might want it to be a free text field. You might want it to be a radio button where someone can only choose one value of a set of values. You might want it to be a multi-select checkbox list where somebody could select more than one value. So these are things you need to be thinking about when you're setting up your collection tool. And then you might be faced with platform functionality that's restrictive. So a good example, specific example from SheEO is, we use Zoom a lot, many meetings, many events. And we collect identity data from people to learn who we are in community with. One piece of data we collect, we ask people to disclose if they're comfortable, is their race and ethnicity. And of course, we want people to be able to answer fully. So for many people, that would include selecting more than one value from a list of values if you're multiracial. And Zoom does not allow, in Zoom meetings, multi-select fields are not allowed. So that's an example where, our platform functionality and our data requirements don't match up. So we have to use a different form tool in order to collect that registration data and then integrate that with Zoom. The burden on the individual versus the burden on us. This is that push and pull of like, who needs to do the work in order to collect the data that needs to be collected. It's going to skew more appropriate one way or the other, depending on what you're dealing with. So a good example from SheEO is, this time last year, we were probably collecting personal identity data from people, maybe like 1, 2, 3 times a year. Now that we're doing so many digital events, often people are asked to register, asked for their identity data many times. They might be asked if they're a super active community member, they might be asked, almost weekly. So it's time for us to start developing a tool that allows people to bypass questions that they have already answered recently. So that's an example of, shifting from it being probably okay for the burden to be on the individual to have to fill out the same form a couple of times a year to it's no longer appropriate, like the burden is on us to set up a system. So we're working with a developer on finding a solution for that. And finally, experimenting and iterating, which we love to do at SheEO. We love to try new things. We love to improve. Just the impact that has on data integrity. So every change that we make, every new platform that we try, every change that we make to a data architecture, it's going to have an impact on our data integrity. What kind of cleanup are we going to need to do? Okay, Tanya, if you can move on, thanks.
Sounds good. There's just a question in the chat there about what tool we use to integrate into Zoom to collect this data. I think that was with the Tito events question.
Yeah, we've used a variety of tools. Really, if you're on Zapier, if you can use an integration as a service tool like Zapier, which connects different platforms, there are many different possibilities. So, any form software really that integrates with Zapier is probably going to be able to get you to creating a Zoom registration. So we've used Tito before, we've used Eventbrite before, FormStack, SurveyGizmo, which is now called Alchemer. So they all have their pros and cons. Some of them are specifically event registration tools and have features that might be appealing. And then, some of the form softwares like FormStack or SurveyGizmo are more powerful, but they're not going to have like the event homepage kind of tools. So just some tips and lessons learned, along the way. Probably lots of people have heard this term, garbage in, garbage out, but if you don't take the time to set up how you collect the data, make sure that it's quality data formatted consistently, you're not going to be able to get meaningful information out of it. You're not going to be able to build knowledge. It's going to be harder to make good decisions. A data model needing to be accessible to the whole team. So, in the fields of data management, knowledge management, there are a lot of ways to build really robust, thorough data schematics, data models, which have a lot of value, but also require a lot of expertise to manage. For a smaller team, especially when many people are going to be working with data, responsible for setting up forms, etc., you need to have some version of a data model that's accessible to the whole team, right? Something that helps people understand these are the questions that we ask, or we might ask. These are the ways they need to be asked. So it needs to be a free text field, or it needs to be a drop-down list. These are the values that are allowed to be selected. So applying some constraints. And these are the places we ask it and how we ask it. So just something simple, like just a list that's showing this is what we ask, this is how we ask it, this is where you should ask it. If you have the resources to have, a data team where someone's responsible for managing a complex data schematic, that's great. But something that's accessible to anyone who needs to work with data is really important. In terms of collection, only collect what you need. It's easy to think of many things that would be nice to know, but it's a lot to ask of an individual to make them share data that you're not going to do anything with. Protecting sensitive information. If you're asking for personal identity data or someone's personal information in terms of where they live, etc., only show that, only make that accessible to whoever needs to use it, and dispose of it when you no longer need it. I've spoken a little bit about, using Zapier and passing data directly to dashboard tools, etc. So just when you're setting those things up, always make sure you're leveraging something when it's worthwhile. So, it's easy to be distracted by the possibility of something integrating, and definitely take advantage of that when it's useful. But if it's something that can be done like super quickly, manually, that's okay too. And finally, just share your learnings with your community. We talked about the feedback loop and how we try and get back to people right away to show how we're actioning their feedback. We talked about how we share dashboards with the activators, etc. If you're asking people for data, if they're sharing it with you, share with them what you've learned. That's it for me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was impressive. I learned a lot. Taking notes the whole time. So I see we have a few minutes left. And so I wanted to, are there any questions from the audience? And so far, we'll give it a second.
Just noticing, hi, it's Vicky here. Just noticing that Deborah is asking about, do you have specific questions, Deborah, around the slides? Obviously, I think the slides are going to be shared by everybody, right?
Yeah.
So.
My question is really probably more generic in nature. And, I have, from the perspective of measurement, I've been looking for, dashboard models and everything to really collect more mechanized data on our part. So I'm really interested in what's been presented here. I think it's excellent. Thank you for sharing, and it's just jogged my memory that we have to get on this.
Great.
Anna,
maybe, or Tanya,
yeah.
Could I throw this to you? Just that,
yeah.
How do we share this so every move isn't being watched?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, everything's anonymized, first of all. So, those activator dashboards, for instance, that we have put out, like none of that demographic data is tied to an individual. So it's just about showing statistics and trends. It's not tied to a specific person, with the exception of maybe something like who's the top referrer of activators, which is something activators have asked to know about. But personal information is just, it's not passed. And we try to be upfront when we're collecting data about, why we're collecting it and what we're going to do with it. So before people are asked to share personal information, they read a statement and agree to the statement that says, SheEO is doing this because we want to better understand our community and be able to, deliver programs appropriately, and that they are always given the chance to select prefer not to disclose. So nobody's forced to contribute personal information that they're not comfortable contributing.
I might just share one other thing. Hi, Vicky from SheEO. One of the things that we also have a couple of, we have some learning circles now and then around some of these tools. How we use the Glide app, for example, we've got something in YouTube around that. And so we're starting to share more and more of like how we do some of these things if people are interested. Please just follow, join up on our newsletter, and because we share our learning circles in there if you want to maybe join some of those to learn a bit more.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, quiet group today.
Deborah, I have one other question. Somehow I thought that maybe this was going to be presented today and then potentially another day. Is that a figment of my imagination, or is it actually going to happen?
I don't believe we have a second session planned. There had been sort of discussions with WEKH and SheEO about doing a bit of a series and perhaps doing some additional content after this, but I don't know that any steps to that effect have been taken. So we are going to be posting this on the website though, and putting up a blog post so that everyone can view it at their leisure.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you.
And if people have any ideas, of course, for anything that is beneficial across the ecosystem, please share it with us. And I think everyone here should have contact information for Megan, myself, Wendy, from the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. And yeah, we're always looking for ways that we can help coordinate across the ecosystem and support and continue these discussions. So please continue. And yeah, there's always new events coming out on our events site as well, and through our newsletter. So yeah, we look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, noting the time, with that, I think we'll wrap up for today. I see there was one additional question in the chat, but I will try to get an answer just as soon as possible for you. Thank you so much, everyone, on behalf of the entire team, and thanks to our friends at SheEO for partnering on this event. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you all soon.